Nice to see you. I hope it's okay if I sit. I may decide that it's time to stand. We'll have to see. It'll be a big adventure for all of us. First, I want to thank Dean Cohen for this whole week and for his hard work on behalf of humanities, and also for allowing this event, and Jim Blasingame, who is my angel, I guess. I was in Jim Blasingame's class, Young Adult Literature, 18 years ago. And I didn't know that young adult literature was a thing before I took his class. And here is my career. So he is very important to me. And he is the things, I could make up stuff too. I mean, he sort of just embellishes, but I could embellish about him. He caught a fish that was 55 feet. Okay, anyway, this is my first public speaking event in a year and a half, and I'm so glad for that. It's so nice to see people again. It would be nicer if we could see faces. We can't yet, but we're going to get there, and that'll be good. Anyhow, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am as a writer, and then we're going to focus on this book, The Bridge, that Jim talked about. I know that the 471 class?
Yes, we were just finished it.
You just finished. Okay, good. So some of you will know what The Bridge reads like, and some of you may not. But I will say this. I am the kind of writer who tends... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm the kind of writer who tends to lean pretty heavily on my own experience. And that doesn't really show up as a bunch of semi-autobiographical novels. What I do instead is, it seems like I translate the hot button issues in my life, the things that have been the most important to me, things that have impacted me the most, into full-fledged young adult novels that are not about me at all. That is sort of what I do. And put another way, I would say that the first seven novels that I have written, the seventh comes out next May. If you look at them, they do a pretty good job of encapsulating my experience through 50 years of life. And I want to take you quickly through the books that I've written. And then I really want to focus on The Bridge. So we won't take too much time, but just to get a sense of what I'm talking about. This is Out of the Pocket. It was my very first novel. I did, in fact, start writing it when I was in Jim Blasingame's class in the summer of 2003. And publishing is hard. It got published in 2008. I think I sold it in 2006. Out of the Pocket is a book about Bobby Framingham. He's a character who is coming out. He's a high school football player. He's closeted. He's gay. He's a big-time prospect. And basically, he's gay. He has to be in the closet about it. There are no professional athletes who are openly gay at this time. Male athletes, I should say, in any of the four major sports. So he tells some friends, and the news gets out, and it becomes a national story. So it's really about coming out in the spotlight. That is about me, in a way, metaphorically, because I, in fact, came out while I was working at ESPN. I was, in fact, a sports writer. There was a story going on about somebody who was claiming to be an openly gay baseball player who was hiding their identity, but they wrote an essay, and all of the sports writers went crazy, and they were talking about what would happen if a player came out in baseball. And I saw all of these writers, all of whom were straight, writing about this, and I was sitting there, I was thinking, I'm not using my voice. So in about, 30 minutes, I wrote an essay called Sports World Still a Struggle for Gays, in which I talked about what it was like for me to be gay in the world of sports. And lo and behold, a couple days later, that appeared on the front page of ESPN.com. So that was my big coming out. I was, in fact, the first openly gay man at ESPN. And the cool thing about it is you look at it now, and it's just a totally different world. So I feel really good about the fact that I was there at the beginning and may have helped push things along. Anyway, so Out of the Pocket was sort of a metaphor about me. I'm not a football player, but I play one on TV. And after I wrote that, I wasn't really sure what to write next. I was really struggling. I didn't want to be the guy who just wrote sports books, like the next one is the coming out hockey player. I didn't want to do that. So I was sort of writing a comic novel that was dealing with some issues that I thought were serious, but it wasn't working. And I was living in Billings, Montana at this time. I'm going to tell you a quick story. One day I was playing racquetball. There used to be pickup racquetball games at this gym in Billings. First of all, if you've never been to Billings, don't go to Billings. But anyhow, we were playing racquetball, and I have this ring, as you can see. At the time, I had a civil union with my partner, Chuck. That was before Marriage 2.0 became legal in 2013. So this was, I guess, in 2010 this happened. And the guy saw my ring and he said, "Oh, you're married. I've never met this person before. We're just hanging out, talking, playing racquetball." And I said, "Yes." And he says, "What's your wife's name?" And I'll tell you, the thoughts that went through my head in that moment, the first one was just annoyance. I was like, I'm going to have to deal with this again. So now I have to make a decision. I'm in Billings, Montana, a conservative city, playing racquetball, which may skew conservative, with a ostensibly straight white male, may skew conservative. And I have to make a decision. And I thought, well, you know, I'm sort of famously gay at this point. Out of the Pocket is out already. I won a big award. So I can't lie about it. And I just looked at him and I said, her name is Sarah. And we just went back to playing. And when I finished that, I got in my car and I thought, what the hell just happened to me? And it was at that moment that Openly Straight came together. Because Openly Straight is a book, it's in some ways a funny book, but in some ways it's a tantrum about what they don't tell you when you come out the first time. And that is that it's a gift that keeps giving. You don't just come out once, you come out every day of your life. Every time you go on an airplane, you may have to make the decision, if you are an LGBTQ person, about what happens if conversation happens. Do you want to open up to somebody who ostensibly may not like what you tell them? The book talks about the fact that there is no such thing as openly straight, that straight people cannot understand what it is like to come out. It also is a love story between a boy who Rafe kind of moves from Boulder, Colorado, where his family's very liberal. He moves to Massachusetts to go to an all-boys boarding school because he's tired of being the openly gay guy, where everything that somebody says, oh, that's the gay guy, or that's the gay soccer player. So he goes to recreate himself. He's not going to lie about it, he's just not going to talk about it. And madness ensues, because in fact, there's really no way to do that. That doesn't work. So the lies pile up. He falls in love with a straight boy who falls in love with him, or a somewhat straight boy questioning. And madness ensues. It turns into quite a thing. That is Openly Straight. God, I'm talking too much about books. The Porcupine of Truth, really quickly. I wrote a book that's basically about spirituality and religion. Oh, I saw Jim doing this and I thought, maybe he has a tick? That's the one. Okay. Porcupine of Truth, my third novel, is definitely my most literary novel, and it's probably my least read novel. I happen to be reading it right now with my creative writing class. Some of them are here. It is an interesting read with that class, that's for sure. It's a book, I think, in some ways is about spirituality and religion, because when I was a kid, I definitely thought religion was not my purview, because when I thought about religion, I thought about anti-gay stuff, and it was all the stuff that I was fighting all my life. So I just didn't like any of that. I threw out all of it. Come to find in my 20s and 30s that I was interested. I was interested in knowing a little bit more about the universe, the cosmic mystery. What is there out there? So as I started to kind of study religion and spirituality, this book came out of me that is about reclaiming religion and spirituality for LGBTQ people, which is a pretty big task that didn't work, but it was a good try. It's also a story that has a mystery, and I can't say anything more because if I ruin that mystery for my students, they'll be very cross. My fourth book was Honestly Ben. Honestly Ben is actually a sequel to Openly Straight. A quick story about that. Honestly Ben, what I didn't know when I wrote Openly Straight is that I had written a love story. I thought I'd written a coming-of-age story. And the difference is that when you write a story that people read as a romance, they have certain expectations. And those expectations, spoiler alert, are not met in Openly Straight. So I started to get emails that said things that surprised me, like, I love you and I hate you. Or, when I finished this book, I threw it across the room. So we realized we had a problem. And I went to my editor, who, by the way, is a great editor, had no idea this was coming either. This is a woman who worked on Harry Potter. We sat there dumbfounded about what was going on. And I said to her in her office, should I write a sequel? And she jumped out of her chair and she said, yes, do that. And when you're in publishing and somebody offers you a book contract, you just smile and nod. So I sort of smiled and nodded and walked out of the room backwards and then thought, how the heck am I going to do that? Because the book is finished. So I had to go back in and write a sequel to Openly Straight. And I wrote it from the point of view of the other boy in the book, the straight or questioning or bisexual, however you want to look at it, boy. It's from his point of view. It's called Honestly, Ben. And I would say, I'm saying they're all about me. This is the one that isn't. It's really about my husband. Ben is based on my husband, which isn't to say I'm dating a teenager. It's that I would call him a teenage, he would say idealized version. I would just say teenage version of my husband, who's a little more athletic. Chuck is hilarious. My husband, he speaks like an 18th century English butler, and he was born on a farm in South Dakota. It's really weird, and I adore him. And so Ben has this sort of weird way of talking, and people fell in love with Ben. So this was an opportunity for me in some ways to work through some of the things I knew about Chuck dealing with as a kid. I'll say no more about it. Book 5 was The Music of What Happens. And I got to do this again. And it's definitely my second most popular novel at this point after Openly Straight. And it is a romance between two boys, Maximo and Jordan, who live in Mesa, Arizona. And it takes place basically on a food truck over the course of one summer. And this book is where I tackled an issue I was looking at a lot right then, which is, I'd say it's about toxic masculinity. It's about the lessons that boys get in this culture about what it means to be a man. And I was really thinking a lot about that at that time. I was trying to, even as a 40-something-year-old man, trying to figure out, what does this all mean? Like, who am I supposed to be and who am I? And how do those go together? So I wrote about one boy, Max, who is a dude bro. Another boy, Jordan, who is sort of quiet and sensitive. And in some ways, they both have something missing, and it's very American what they have missing. The boy, Max, the dude bro, has no ability to be vulnerable at all. He has been taught to smile through everything and to have no feelings except anger. And he has some stuff going on, and so during the book, things are coming, and he has no way of dealing with it because he has to man up. Meanwhile, Jordan has gotten something, and I would say this is an issue that I see young gay men in particularly dealing with, which is being told that they're less of a man, that they're not quite a man. And this is even by people who are allies and friends. I have had friends who have, talked to me in ways that I thought, wait a second, what do you think I am? So I wanted to write about a boy who also had been told that so much that he'd given up, and that who in fact does need to, I would say, warrior up, who needs to get stronger and believe in himself. So that's what that book is about. It's a love story. It was meant to be a love story. And finally, book number 6 is The Bridge. The Bridge was like coming out again. I had written about all these books. I'd covered so many things about LGBTQ issues. And there's one other thing about me that I really hadn't talked about, and that is that I have suffered all my life with chronic depression. It probably started earlier, but it was diagnosed when I was 19. And I wanted to write about this part of my life. When I was 27, the chronic depression caught up with me and there was a suicide attempt. So I have that in my background. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it. But what I wanted to do here was I wanted to write a book that would touch on this topic and this difficult topic in a way that would be safe and in the end hopeful. I had seen, and I think all of you had seen, a book, a young adult book that became a TV show, 13 Reasons Why. And I don't mind it as a book, but I think it's useless in terms of discussing issues of suicide. I mean, I think it is actually triggering. So I wanted to do something where we could remove the taboo of talking about it and find a way. And what I think is that we have to talk all the way through the issue. When we talk about suicide, depression, we need to not just talk about the moment and what happened. We have to talk about the options. And then really what this book is about options. So what the book is, in short, it is 4 stories. A boy, the thing that happens at the start of the novel, at the start of all 4 stories, is that a boy and girl meet on top of the George Washington Bridge in New York City. They are both depressed and they are both there to jump, and they interrupt each other. Based on what happens as they are sitting 100 feet apart, both with one leg over the ledge, the world then splits into 4 different realities. So we get 4 stories. And in the first story, the girl jumps and the boy doesn't. And we get the aftermath for the boy in his decision not to. And in a departure from my other novels, we also get all the points of view. So we get the family members, parents, and it's all third person, but we get into their heads. So we find out what it's like for Tilly's parents and family. When that story ends, we go right back to that moment, and this time Tilly decides not to jump, but Aaron decides to jump. And it's a tough moment when you're reading this book. There are a lot of tough moments in this book because we've fallen in love with Aaron in the first story. We have to deal with his father's anguish, and we love his father too. And this time we get to learn a little bit more about Tilly because she's made the brave choice to stay another day. In the third story, it's a shorter story. Both Aaron and Tilly decide to jump. And we move way into the future and we find out about the people we know and how they're impacted by these decisions. But also, we meet people we haven't even met before. And we see how they're impacted by the suicides of people they don't even know. And finally, in the fourth and my favorite story, they both decide not to jump. And it's about the connection that the two of them create with each other. And it's life-affirming and life-changing and life-saving, really, for both of them. So I would say that this is a novel in some ways it explores the butterfly effect when it comes to suicide. And I think because of that, because of the options, it seems to be far less triggering for readers. It's not to say it's an easy read. Nobody thinks it's an easy read. I'll talk more about that. It's certainly the hardest book I've ever had to write. Finally, next May, this book comes out. None of you have read this yet, including Jim Blasingame. It's called Destination Unknown. And because I had just written about suicide, a really heavy topic, I felt like it was my time to write about something much lighter. So I wrote about the 1980s and AIDS. I'm kidding. That's not right at all. But it sounds like I just go to dark topics, but it's just I'm just writing about my life. I grew up in 1980s New York City. It was the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic when it started, and people were dying and there was no cure. And I grew up believing that I was probably going to die at some point. So that is the background, and I created 2 characters, neither of them me, but both with parts of me, who meet and connect. And I don't know if I'd call it a love story. I'd call it a story about the time and place with 2 characters that hopefully we come to love. Anyhow, with that all said, how did I do? I did pretty well. I think we're going to move into questions. Jim, do you want to take care of asking?
Here is what I want to suggest. Bill, you can go to the one more. Oh, here we go. If you would do this, if Bill, you would say question 1, and so Isabel, you will stand and ask 1, and then Bill, or when you're satisfied, say thank you, and then Bill, you'll say 2, and Kelly, I saw Kelly. There you are. Will read hers, and then you'll say thank you, and then Bill will say 3, and Grace will. Does that make sense? And we've got 11 questions. Does that sound good?
12.
Well, I combined 2
Oh,
after we talked.
how dare we? Oh, by the way, this is what my face looks like.
Oh!
All right. How about question number 1?
And it's okay to say your name.
So, Isabel.
Isabel isn't here.
Oh.
What young adult books or movies did you grow up with? Are there any in particular that inspired you as a young reader?
So, as a young reader, of course, it was a different time. I certainly devoured the Judy Blume books when I was very young. I thought they were amazing. I stole my sister's copies of those and loved them. But in terms of LGBTQ, or books that represented me in 1986, 87, 88, there was almost nothing. And there was no internet, so I couldn't find them. And when I started to realize I was gay, I went to the high school, the library in my high school, and locked myself away, or I didn't lock myself, I looked through the little Dewey Decimal System card thing, which maybe doesn't exist anymore, I don't know, and looked up homosexuality, and was ready to turn to horticulture in case somebody saw it. And there were very few things that were in the library, but it told me to go to an encyclopedia. So I went to the encyclopedia, and unfortunately, that encyclopedia had not been updated since 1971. There's a reason that matters. It matters because it was the year 1972 when the American Psychiatric Association decided that being gay wasn't a mental illness. That's very recently. But unfortunately, on that day, when I went to find out something about who I was, I found out I was mentally ill, according to the encyclopedia. That's a tough one. So really, it was hard for me to find anything that inspired me, that helped me see myself. The best thing that happened to me was, I think when I was 16, I was in New York City, I found the Oscar Wilde bookstore down in the Village. That is a gay bookstore. I felt like I had found, the answer. And I walked in and I just wanted to read everything. And I read, I think the first book I read that really spoke to me was Tales of the City by Armistead Maupin, which has since become, I guess, a movie and then a Netflix series. It's such a lovely story of San Francisco in the 70s, where there are all of these different people and they all have such beautiful hearts. And there were gay people and straight people and trans people and people of every nationality and ethnicity, and I loved that. It was the first place I saw my heart. And I think it was the first time that I realized that I wanted to write books, just like Armistead Maupin did. So yeah, that's what I have. The second question is Kelly.
Hi.
Hi.
So my group came up with the question, why did you choose to portray 2 suicidal characters instead of 1? Or why did you decide to have the 2 different storylines, Aaron and Tilly?
Sure. Yeah, I think, the answer to that is simple math. What I didn't, if I only had the one character, what I would be writing about in some ways was 2 options. Either he lives or he dies. So just by math, if I add another, suddenly I have 4 possibilities. And I really wanted to look at the different options from a wider scope. So that's why I did it. And really, I was trying to counter, with this book, I was trying to counter the lie that my brain tells me when I'm feeling really depressed. And what that lie tells me is that I'm worthless, that I will never amount to anything, and that it wouldn't matter if I were here or not. That's what my brain says. And all of those things are a lie. And if you have struggled with depression, and your brain has told you that, it is a lie. So I wanted to show the deep impact on people that we knew, that those characters knew, but also people they didn't know. In the early drafts of The Bridge, there were actually 6 other characters who I followed. So if you think about that, that's 6 other characters that had to be in 4 different novels, so there different stories. So there were 24 more things going on. That's the reason it wound up not making it. It was exhausting and confusing. But if you recall, those of you who have read it, I think it's in the 4th story when they both decide to live. They meet a girl outside of Dunkin' Donuts and buy her coffee. That was a character in all 4 stories. Her life was. There was another character who didn't make the cut in any way, who was a drug addict, who simply was walking down the street at the time that either Aaron or Tilly, depending on the story, or both of them, or neither of them, would have been walking from the bridge to the subway. And based on who is walking towards that man in those stories, his life turns out completely differently in each of the 4. I have to say, I kind of miss that aspect of the bridge. I get that it was too much, but I sort of miss it. Anyhow, yeah, that's my answer. Is that good? Okay, Grace?
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to say first, I really, really love the bridge, and it's so exciting to hear you talk about it. When you were writing the novel, what audience did you have in mind? Were you thinking of people who have experienced similar mental issues in order to give them protagonists they can relate to? Or is it for people who have not experienced these issues personally so that they can understand better?
Good question. You know, the truth is that I actually don't write with an audience in mind in general. What I've found is if I focus on my audience when I'm writing, it gets in the way of me inhabiting the characters, which is the most important thing. And it also gets me to the place where I start trying to teach lessons. And if there's one thing I don't like in young adult books, it's lessons. I wouldn't have wanted them as a kid, and I don't want to write them. So I feel like those lessons will be there anyway, if I just write the truth. So that's true. However, it is a good question because I guess in my mind, I was writing for people so that they could see themselves, other people who are struggling with mental illness, especially depression, hypomania, bipolar disorder. And as I wrote, it began to dawn on me that because of the way I was writing, because I was going into so many different people's minds, that it was an excellent opportunity to help people also who had no idea, who haven't experienced these things. So it turned out to be both. Thank you. Good. 4?
Hello. Angie. Okay. So my question largely pertains to just being consumed by grief or depression, as you talked about. How do you prepare yourself for the raw emotions of such work? And do you put up a guard, or do you just let yourself feel everything during such writing process?
You know, the tough answer to that question is for me, and probably for most people, I don't know if you can really write well with the guard up. I don't think that really works. So it's very hard to write about this stuff. I went to places in writing this novel that I specifically tried to end my life not to feel when I was 27 years old. But I felt like I had to go in there again. And it was very, very challenging. I had to do a lot of self-care as I was writing this book. I would tend to write my way of writing back then anyway, it's changed because I've moved, is I used to go to a coffee shop in Tempe called Extreme Bean, and I would sit in their little bank vault. It was a former bank vault, and I liked that. And I would write from 7 to 12, and I knew when I was done at 12 that I had to have a phone call set up. I had to have somebody to call who I knew would pick up, because I can't do this alone. Art isn't always safe. And this wasn't a safe place for me to be, and so the only thing I had there was self-knowledge of what I needed, and that helped. Kelly? Kelly?
Okay. Yeah. What kind of research did you do for this book? So we had this question. We were kind of thinking of did you have to do interviews, because there were so many different characters that for a reveal, like, for example, the therapist for both characters, but we were having this question because the depressive, manic, bipolar episodes were very well written and believable. And then also recently I was thinking, like I said, the therapist, it just seemed like something so real. So we were wondering, like, how did you research those types of situations?
Well, there were things that I had to research, but I think in terms of dealing with the depictions of depression and bipolar disorder, those just came from me. I wish I didn't know the interior of depression as well as I know it. I'd give a lot of money not to know that, but I know it. So that just came from me. And in fact, there is a hypomanic episode in two of the stories. And that happened to me, just like it happens to the character Aaron in this book, when I was first put on medication when I was 19. Suddenly, me, and so imagine me at 19, not hard to do, probably just younger and cuter, and skinnier. Suddenly I decided I was going to be the first white rapper, despite the fact that I don't rap. Gay white rapper. Anyway, all sorts of stuff like this. The thing about hypomania and mania is that it was interesting because something can be two things at once. And hypomania and mania are funny and incredibly not funny at the same time. Because people hurt themselves with their actions when they're manic. But some of the things we do when we're there can be sort of funny. I could slip right back into that so quickly. I just remembered the mind frame of the spinning and all of that. As far as the research, I did in fact talk to a few people. I spoke to people who are bipolar, two friends of mine who are bipolar I interviewed, because in fact I'm not bipolar. They just thought I was for a moment because of my hypomanic episode. That was just caused by medicine. But I really wanted to know their experience. I felt like it was important because I wasn't sure what Aaron is. Is Aaron bipolar? I don't know. You've read the book, I've written the book, I'm not sure. Also, I did, as you said, I had to speak to grief counselors quite a bit. Once I started to write the book, I realized that just as much as this is a story about having suicidal ideation, it's also the story about having loved ones who have suicidal ideation. And I don't know what that's like. So I really needed to talk to people who had talked to parents, who had talked to brothers and sisters. And that was very, very interesting for me. I learned a lot. Yeah, that's what I have. Thank you so much. Oh, I don't know who SDJ, it's
That's me.
a set.
It's a Sarah.
Okay, hi.
Hi, I liked your book a lot. And you answered this in part, but what inspired you to make the characters? Because they feel really genuine. And are they based off of anyone that you experienced or personal experience?
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Who are the characters based off of, and what inspired you to make them?
Thank you for that question. It's a good question, and maybe a surprising answer. Aaron and Tilly really are the two sides of my depression. I looked at it that way when I started, and there are two parts of my childhood, and I split them off. Aaron's a character. Aaron was a gay boy, is a 17-year-old gay boy who suffers from depression. I could inhabit that very easily. Aaron lived in the book where I lived as a teenager. And I know those rhythms of depression, and I knew that character. And by the way, I just want to make a point about that. I mentioned he's gay. One thing that's very different about this book that I did on purpose is this isn't the story of a boy who attempts suicide or doesn't because he's gay. This is a story of a book who attempts suicide and he's gay, and there's a difference there. I had read that other book, and there's nothing wrong with it. That's a really important book. If you go to the Trevor Project website, you can see the awful statistics about LGBTQ youth and suicide, and it'll stun you every time. But I didn't want to write that story. I wanted to write something different. Anyhow, so that is one side, and Aaron's depression is clinical, is chemical. He has something in his brain that causes his depression. I once had a very, I thought, rude question from an interviewer who said, "Why did you start with the boy who didn't really have that much wrong with him?" And I was like, what? It doesn't matter what's wrong with you. If you suffer from depression, it impacts your brain. So it's not like that question that sometimes people get about, like, what are you depressed about, is an erroneous question. That said, Tilly has a different story. Tilly as a character, she's not like me. She is adopted. She is from originally South Korea, so not like me. But I made her those things, and I put her living where so when I was 4, my parents divorced. I lived in New York City, and my father moved across town. And from that time on, I never again felt like my father was my father. I always felt like I was an outsider. And then he married again, and he had another child, and I felt totally like the ugly duckling, the ugly step brother or whatever. So Tilly embodies that for me. She's an outsider. I chose those things about her because I wanted her to feel different. The way I felt different was I was secretly gay. But Tilly has her own issues. I think basically she feels unloved and alone, and that is a situational sort of depression. There are things that can make us depressed, even if we don't maybe have the same chemical things going on in our brains. So really I'm writing about 2 kinds of depression with these 2 characters. So thanks for the question. Maddie?
Hello. As you developed them, how did you keep these discrete, complex characters from bleeding together, specifically in the 3rd story, when we have so many different perspectives?
Yeah, thanks for that. It wasn't easy. There was nothing easy about writing this book, but it was so hard to keep things separate. I'm going to tell you that it was harder at first because I erred when I started writing this book, and I had it so I wrote it chronologically at first. So you would find out that on April 23rd, these 4 things could have happened. So instead of writing 4 stories, one after the other, I was writing story 1A, story 1B, story 1C, story 1D. It was extraordinarily confusing, probably, and worse for readers than for writers. But I wasn't keeping things straight. It was all over the place. So I was glad when I came up with the answer to put them in as stories. That made it easier. I think the answer in some ways is that the cool thing about being a published author is you get to hide behind many drafts. People don't see your first draft. And so it's cool because people think, wow, you did that. How did you do that? And I think, oh, it's magic. No, it's not magic. It's hard work, and it sometimes takes a bunch of drafts to get there. Thanks. Nadia, is that right?
That's right. How did you manage to craft so many intertwining narratives and move so fluidly between them all?
So intertwining narratives. It wasn't easy. Basically, I had so many documents in this. So it's all digital, of course. I'm a Microsoft Word person, but there's a thing that's called the Bridge. It's my folder, and I would guess that there are 150 documents in there. So I'm writing the stories sometimes in there and cutting and pasting them into the novel when they happen, because maybe in a situation, and it was all over in terms of how I did this. Some places it was this way, some places it was that way. But let's say I was really involved in the story of Tilly dealing with her bully Molly. I might not want to cut out of her mind and into somebody else's so quickly. So I might have written that whole story there and then cut and pasted. But beyond that, in terms of narratives, No, I think that's enough. That is sort of what I mean. I'm just looking at the time, making sure we're okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. What is the next question? Oh, this thing. Dr. Saco.
Hello. With such an emotional, dense topic, did you ever have to step away from writing the bridge? How did you keep yourself mentally well?
Thank you for that question. There was actually only one time that I had to step away from the bridge. I feel like I did a pretty good job of self-care while I was writing it, but one scene knocked me around. And I'll tell you, it's the scene in the, I think, second story, Tilly's story, when she goes to confront her father. Tilly has a tough relationship with her father. She feels unloved. And on the day that she, after contemplating being on the George Washington Bridge, she goes to see her father at work, and he sends her off. He can't see her. And as she's walking away, she realizes that, in fact, he knows that she's in a bad way. And she just breaks. It just breaks her. And she goes and she yells at him, and she walks off, and she's in a stupor. She's in a depressive daze, a suicidal daze. And Molly catches up with her and touches her shoulder, and she asks one question. She says, I have trouble talking about this without crying still. She says, Tilly, what is the likelihood that that your father will ever be the person you want him to be, that he'll ever love you the way that you want? And Tilly just, is shocked by the question, and she finally answers, nil. And that moment came from my life. After my suicide attempt, I went to see a therapist who I had seen as a teenager, and I think he was frustrated with me, actually, which is not a great thing to be as a therapist. But he asked me that question. He's like, so you're still dealing with your father? I said, yes. He said, what is the likelihood? And in the moment that I said to him, nil, my life changed. And something about that scene of just allowing Tilly to sob made me sob, and it brought that pain back to me, just being a teenager and just feeling completely unloved. And I finished writing that scene, and I went to bed. I lay down in bed, and I stayed there for a couple days, and I was okay with it. There were certain things that were going to be hard to write, and that was hard to write. So thanks for that question. I appreciate it. 10. Who is this? Who is 10? Samantha?
Oh my gosh, is she not here? She never misses. Who are the people who you dedicated your book to?
Right.
What is your history with them, and what role did they play in inspiring you to write this?
So I dedicated the bridge to Ned Vizzini and Amy King, who is also known as A.S. King. They're both young adult authors, and they were both friends. Ned Vizzini was a brilliant author. Some of you may have either read his book or seen the movie that was made of his book called It's Kind of a Funny Story, that takes place in a mental institution. Nate blurbed Openly Straight, and he was so supportive. And we started to have this really nice friendship. We're beginning to really create that friendship when in December of 2013, the same year that Openly Straight came out, he died by suicide. So that was a shock to a lot of people. I mean, we all knew that he was struggling with mental health. He always had. But it just was a sock in the gut to so many of us. And for Amy, for A.S. King, she's a close friend of mine, a wonderful author. If you haven't read A.S. King, read her. And her daughter, Gracie, in 2018, died by suicide. And so a lot of us have been supporting her through that, and she's just an incredibly strong and courageous and beautiful woman, and I just felt like I wanted to give her something, so I acknowledged her. Thanks. And then, what do we?
How do you manage your relationship with your fan base? And do you have any advice for aspiring writers of general fiction? And there are a ton in this class. It might even be everybody.
Okay.
Who's got a manuscript finished or going or an idea. And there's going to be some famous authors come out of this.
Okay. All right. Well, good. We could use more. So a few things. I sort of like two different questions. The first about fan base. I mean, first of all, it's just kind of freaky to have fans. I mean, that's a sort of surreal aspect of this because I'm two different people. I'm the person that nobody knows who walks around my neighborhood, and when I go to certain places, conferences or bookstores or blah, 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 I'm something else, and that feels really weird. I guess when it comes to that, I hope that I deal with it gracefully. I don't know, you'd have to ask them. But I think there's a second part of that question too, because we're talking about the bridge. I guess I could say a little bit more about that. I get a ton of emails from readers, and it's lovely to get emails, and I will always write readers back. It is my rule to write everybody back, but I also don't sort of suggest moving forward with back and forth emails. I can't do it. There have been a few times that has happened. There was a teenage boy named Reagan from Missouri who was in a horrendous situation who wrote me, and I became a supporter of his and somebody who helped him while he was going through awful stuff with his religious family. He's now in college and doing really well, and I still am in touch with him. So there are a few people like that, but mostly I try to just be gracious and just gracious and back away. In terms of the other things, though, when I get emails, on the bridge, right? The bridge is a little bit different because the emails that I get, and certainly if I were to be out in public, as I said, this is my first time out doing an event talking about the bridge in person. We were expecting when this book came out, first of all, that I was going to do a school tour, which would have been really intense. Go to every high school and every day talk about suicide and my own attempt. That would have been hard. And furthermore, what happens when people come up and want to share their story? And so we had talked about it at Scholastic, my publishing house, with my editor and my publicist about how to handle it. It was a tough one. We're going to have to put up some boundaries and let people know as kindly as I could that I'm an empath. And there are just a certain number of stories I can take in, and the rest I just don't have the bandwidth for, which is a really hard thing to say to somebody who wants to share how important your book was to you. And it's not that nobody can do that, it's just there will be times when I get overwhelmed, I think. Luckily or unluckily, because of COVID, it hasn't been that bad. Emails are easy to answer, and I can do that. The other part of the question is about...
Any advice for aspiring writers on YA?
Marry rich. I would say that's not you know what I would say is focus on the writing. It's very easy to kind of get ahead of yourself and start thinking about the aspect of publishing a book. And two things. One is that the joy is in the creation, and the second thing is this market is tough. When I published my first book in 2008, Out of the Pocket, it won the Lambda Literary Award, which is like the book, the #1 book for LGBTQ youth that year. There is no question to me now that if I tried to publish Out of the Pocket as a debut novel now, I don't think it would get published. The books have just gotten better and better and better and more complicated. So I think what I would say is write the best book you can. Just focus on that thing and make it terrific. Because that book is going to have to not just be liked, but adored by an agent and a publisher and a publishing house. And so that's some high stakes. And the only way you can do that is if you just do the greatest work you can and be patient. If you are not somebody who likes to be rejected, do something else. There will be rejection. And the great thing is that the rejection just gets different levels. after the beginning rejection, then you have to sort of deal with bad reviews or not making lists and stuff like that. So it's a hard business. My husband, who is a lawyer, says, I think my job is nothing compared to yours. But I'm not actually wanting to scare you. I think it's also the best thing. I have loved every minute of it, but just don't go into it without a mind that is ready for a journey, because it'll be a lot.